I balanced the champagne tray on my palm, the stemware trembling slightly as I crossed the ballroom. Every chandelier glittered like ice, every laugh sounded rehearsed. The Napa Valley sun had just dipped behind the vineyard, leaving the wedding hall soaked in gold light and superiority. My sister Vanessa looked ethereal at the center of it, all her lace gown 1,000 tiny diamonds. Our mother Margaret Monroe floated beside her like she was being crowned queen. Vanessa always knew how to make an entrance, someone whispered near me. I smiled faintly the way servers do when they're invisible. My mother's voice rose above the music, sweet as honey and just as sticky. "Oh, that's Rachel," she said, to a group of guests watching me pour wine. "She's just helping with the serving. She's always been wonderful in the kitchen." The laughter that followed felt like champagne bubbles popping inside my chest. I had coordinated presidential fundraisers, celebrity galas, award season after-parties, and tonight my family decided I should hand out glasses at my sister's wedding. I lowered my eyes, pretending to adjust the tray so they wouldn't see my face flush. The band shifted to a waltz. I slipped through tables draped in ivory silk past the mountain of imported orchids and a 7-tier cake that probably cost more than my first apartment. Vanessa was radiant, her new husband kissing her hand as cameras flashed. Every moment screamed perfection. I tried to lose myself in the rhythm of Service Phil's smile retreat, yet each step echoed the same words I'd heard all my life. Vanessa is our pride and joy. Rachel's good with her hands. A waiter bumped me gently as he passed. "Careful," he muttered. But my attention had already snagged on the far end of the hall. A man stood near the tasting bar watching me. Not with pity. With interest. His gray suit fit like it was cut for him, and only him crisp against the soft light. I recognized him a second too late, Elliott Ward, CEO of Ward Industries. My breath caught. His company had been on my target list for months. They'd requested a proposal from Luna Events, my company, and then silence. I turned away before he could see me staring. My heart thudded like it wanted out. "Focus, Rachel. Deliver the drinks. Don't trip. Don't care." The tray wobbled slightly as I reached the head table. "Careful," dear mother murmured without looking at me. "Don't spill on the bridal gown." I swallowed hard and took one step back, straight into someone's shoulder. The tray tilted. Red wine cascaded like blood across the white linen. Gasps. A few shouts. The stemware crashed against the marble floor. When I spun around, my heart dropped straight to my shoes. The man I'd hit was Elliott Ward himself. His gray vest, his shirt soaked in Merlot. Time froze. The band stopped mid-note. My mother's shriek sliced through the silence. "Rachel," she hissed, horror flashing in her eyes. Vanessa's smile died on her lips. Guests turned wide-eyed. I could feel heat climbing my neck, shame choking me. I'm so sorry," I stammered, reaching for the napkins on the table. "I didn't see." But Elliott raised his hand. "It's fine," he said calmly. His voice was deep-textured like smoke. He glanced down at his ruined shirt, then back at me, and something unexpected flickered across his expression: amusement. "Red suits me better anyway." He held out his hand. "Rachel Monroe, isn't it?" The room went utterly still. My mother froze mid-step. Vanessa blinked. "You know her," someone whispered. I stared at him, utterly confused. "Yes," I said finally, voice trembling. "I mean, I don't think we've—" He interrupted gently. "We've been trying to reach you for months. Your proposal for the Horizon Gala Luna events. Right. It was brilliant." His tone was warm, genuine, carrying just enough volume for half the room to hear. I blinked, dizzy. Horizon Gala. The deal my team spent half a year preparing, the one that vanished when we never got a reply. You saw that." "Of course," he said, smiling. "I was beginning to think you'd changed your mind about working with us." For a heartbeat, no one spoke. My mother's face drained of color. Vanessa's champagne glass slipped slightly in her grip. "Luna Events," one of the investors echoed. "Is that her company?" Elliot nodded. One of the most promising event firms in Seattle. He turned to me again. I'm glad fate arranged this meeting, though. Next time, let's skip the wine bath. The laughter that followed wasn't mocking this time. It was real disbelieving, a ripple of amusement that broke the tension. I felt my chest tighten, not with shame now, but something close to relief. My mother tried to recover, voice brittle. Rachel helps with our family events sometimes. She has a little business. Elliot's smile sharpened. Little, I read your reports, Mrs. Monroe. Luna Events handled the governor's charity ball last spring. That's hardly little. Margaret Monroe's smile cracked. She glanced toward the guests, searching for an escape, but the tide had turned. People whispered, impressed, now curious. Vanessa's fiancé cleared his throat, unsure whether to speak. Elliot handed me a napkin, still smiling. I'll have my assistant call you Monday morning. Let's finalize that partnership, shall we? My lips parted. Of course, I whispered. I'll be ready. He tipped his head, then walked away as if nothing at all had happened. Behind me, the orchestra hesitantly resumed. But the air had shifted. The pity in people's eyes was gone, replaced with curiosity, or was it respect? My mother sat rigid, her hand gripping the tablecloth so tight her knuckles whitened. Vanessa smiled too brightly at guests who no longer looked at her but at me. I turned, stepping away before anyone could speak to me. My heart beat so hard it hurt. The vineyard air outside felt cooler, cleaner. The night sky was streaked with silver clouds and the faint scent of grapes. I leaned against the stone wall, finally breathing. Inside, the music swelled again, desperate to pretend nothing had changed. But it had. For 34 years I had been the helper, the extra set of hands, the woman behind the curtain. In one accidental spill, the curtain had fallen and the world finally saw me. I stayed there a while, listening to the laughter fading behind glass doors. My hands still smelled faintly of wine, but for the first time I didn't feel like apologizing. From the terrace, I could see my mother pacing at the edge of the hall, whispering sharply to Vanessa. Their silhouettes looked small against the glowing chandeliers. Elliot's voice drifted faintly as he laughed with the investors, his words indistinct but confident. Every gesture, every sound told me one simple truth: I didn't need to stand at their table to belong in that room. When the party ended, I slipped out quietly. The parking lot shimmered under fairy lights. As I walked toward my car, I caught a glimpse of Elliot near the exit, his suit jacket draped over his arm. He saw me and lifted a hand. Don't forget Monday, he called. I won't, I said. He smiled. Good. I'd hate to lose you again. The words followed me, long after I started the engine. Through the windshield, the vineyard lights blurred into gold threads stretching across the dark hills. My pulse steadied, my lips forming a quiet, incredulous laugh. Maybe accidents weren't always disasters. Sometimes they were wake-up calls. By the time I reached the end of the long driveway, the laughter from the hall had faded completely. Only the hum of my car filled the silence. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror, a woman with flushed cheeks, wine-stained fingers, and a faint, defiant smile. This, I whispered to myself, is the last time I serve at anyone's table. Outside, the night air shifted, carrying the first scent of rain. I rolled down the window and let it in, feeling something inside me unlock small, electric, alive. The headlights carved a silver path ahead, stretching beyond the vines, leading straight toward Monday morning and whatever came next. The rain had followed me north from Napa, drumming softly against the windshield as I drove back to Seattle. I should have been exhausted after the wedding, after that surreal moment when a man in a wine-stained suit had said he'd been trying to reach me. But I couldn't sleep. Every time the wipers swept across the glass, I saw my mother's face frozen in disbelief, Vanessa's perfect smile cracking. Somewhere between the vineyards and the empty highway, the memories I'd kept locked away for years started clawing their way back. I was 8 when I first learned what it meant to be less than. Our house back in Portland was the kind with white shutters and a perfect lawn. Mother believed appearances were the only truth worth protecting. Vanessa, 3 years younger, had her curls tied with satin ribbons and a smile that made adults melt. I had scraped knees ink on my fingers and a habit of asking questions. When relatives visited, Mother would beam at Vanessa's piano pieces. Then she'd gesture toward me and say, "Rachel helps in the kitchen." At 18, I was still helping. That Christmas, our dining room was a theater of wealth. Silver candles, the scent of roasted turkey. Mother's friends praised Vanessa's early admission to Columbia's PR program. When they asked about me, Mother answered with her practiced laugh. "Rachel got into culinary school. She loves being hands-on." I remember gripping the carving knife tighter, pretending not to hear the smirk in her tone. Vanessa winked at me across the table, her sympathy almost worse than the mockery. The pattern never changed. Vanessa brought home trophies and internships. I brought home recipes and ideas. Father, quiet as ever, buried himself in business talk whenever tension thickened. It was Mother who dictated our worth, and mine was always measured by how well I served. After college, I refused to stay under her roof. I rented a shoebox apartment above a bakery and worked double shifts at the Lakeview Hotel managing banquets for tourists who couldn't pronounce my name right. That job taught me the business of elegance, the lighting, the pacing, the illusion that magic just happens. I saw how a well-run event could turn chaos into memory, and for the first time I felt powerful. The staff respected me. Guests thanked me. My mother never called. I started Luna Events with 2 credit cards and more grit than sense. I named it after the moon because it doesn't need permission to shine. It just reflects what's already there. My first client was a retired couple celebrating 40 years of marriage. I worked 18 hours straight, arranging flowers, designing place cards by hand, washing dishes when the caterer failed. They hugged me afterward, crying. "You made it feel like our story mattered," the wife said. I drove home that night with $50 profit and the conviction that I could build something real. For years, business grew quietly. Small weddings, corporate launches, charity luncheons. I built a team, learned to negotiate, learned not to apologize for success. Then came the Thompson Hotel contract, our big break. It was worth more than I'd ever earned. I told my parents at dinner, my first visit home in months. The house hadn't changed. Even the air smelled of polished wood and disapproval. "I'm proud of you," Father said softly. Mother smiled too quickly. "Hotels are tricky clients, dear. I hope you have the experience for it." 2 weeks later, the contract was gone. The hotel manager emailed saying they'd heard concerns about reliability. When I called, he sounded embarrassed. "Someone claiming to represent your family contacted us. Said you were transitioning careers, might not fulfill large-scale events." I sat frozen at my desk, the phone hot against my ear. The only people who could have known about that contract were sitting at that dinner table. I confronted Mother the next evening. She didn't deny it. "I just wanted to make sure you weren't taking on more than you could handle," she said, slicing lemons, as if we were discussing weather. "Failure at that level would have humiliated you." "It humiliated me anyway," I snapped. She sighed, wiping her hands. "You're too emotional, Rachel. That's why people don't trust you with real responsibility." I left her kitchen shaking, promising myself never to give her another chance to interfere. That night I sat in my car until dawn, staring at my company's logo on my phone screen, wondering if I should quit. But I didn't. I rebuilt. Every time a door slammed, I made a new one. If Mother was going to define success by social invitations and last names, I'd define mine by persistence. Years passed. Luna Events became a quiet powerhouse in Seattle. We planned fundraisers for cancer research, museum openings, even a senator's re-election gala. My client list grew. My family's interest did not. On holidays, I sent gifts they never acknowledged. Vanessa's career, of course, bloomed under Mother's guidance. She joined a major PR firm, her face on glossy magazines. Every article called her a rising star in strategic communication. I wondered if manipulation had a glamorous name in her world too. Still, there were nights I caught myself longing for one kind word from Mother, some proof she'd ever been proud. Then I'd remember the Thompson contract and the way she looked past me at every family dinner, and that longing would turn to steel. Last year, Elizabeth joined Luna Events as my operations manager, a whirlwind of efficiency and dry humor. "You need to stop apologizing for existing," she told me after our first week together. "You're the boss, not the help." I laughed, but her words stuck. With her and James, our CFO, I finally felt like I wasn't fighting alone. We landed the Horizon Resorts proposal last fall, a national rebranding campaign, 5 cities, multi-million-dollar budget. Elizabeth stayed up 3 nights perfecting the presentation. I wrote the narrative myself. Luxury isn't about opulence, it's about belonging. It was the most ambitious pitch we'd ever made. Then months of silence. When I asked Elizabeth if we'd heard back, she frowned. Their office said they emailed 2 weeks ago, but maybe it got lost in spam. It never did. Someone had rerouted our correspondence. I changed our servers, tightened security, moved on. Until Elliot Ward mentioned Horizon by name at my sister's wedding. Now driving home through sheets of rain, the pieces clicked together like cruel poetry. Horizon Resorts. Ward Industries. Vanessa's fiancé working in corporate PR. My family's obsession with image. I pulled into a gas station outside Portland, hands shaking. The neon lights reflected off the windshield like shattered stars. For 15 years, I'd been fighting ghosts, contracts, disappearing rumors, spreading doors, closing without explanation. Maybe it hadn't been bad luck. Maybe it had been them all along. I stepped out into the drizzle, breathing the wet night air. The truth settled in my chest like a stone, heavy but clarifying. I'd spent my whole life trying to earn love from people who only respected control. Maybe the accident at that wedding wasn't an accident at all. Maybe it was the universe finally handing me a mirror. By the time I crossed into Seattle at dawn, exhaustion had melted into focus. I parked outside the Luna Events office and watched the city wake up. Gray skies, coffee steam car horns. The sign above the door gleamed softly in the morning light. Luna Events. My name, my work, my life. Not theirs. Inside, the scent of lemon polish greeted me. I walked past the framed photos of our best events, each one proof that I'd built something solid out of the ashes they'd left. I poured myself a cup of coffee, staring at the horizon beyond the window. The phone buzzed a new message. Unknown number. Meeting confirmed Monday, 10 a.m. Ward Industries, San Francisco. Clara Wynn, executive assistant to Mr. Elliot Ward. For a long moment, I just stared at the screen. Then I smiled, slow and certain. The rain had stopped. I whispered into the quiet office. Let's see what happens when I stop being the help. Outside, the city lights blinked awake. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled faintly over the bay, not a warning, but a promise. 3 days before the wedding, I drove through the rolling vineyards of Napa Valley, sunlight dripping across the hills like honey. Silvercrest Vineyard sprawled ahead, a private estate rented for what my mother proudly called the most important social event of the year. I parked near the staff entrance the same way I always did when attending family occasions, as someone who worked there. Inside, the ballroom decorators scurried between towers of white roses and crystal chandeliers. The scent of lavender floated through the air, dizzying and too sweet. At the far end of the hall, I spotted my mother in a tailored cream suit, directing people like a general on parade. "That centerpiece is crooked," she barked. "And make sure the candles are hand-dipped, not machine." When she saw me, her expression shifted to polite surprise, the way you'd greet a contractor who arrived uninvited. "Oh, Rachel, good you came. The planners are hopeless. I told Vanessa you'd know how to fix things." "I thought you hired a full team from LA, I said, glancing at the staff already unrolling velvet carpets. "They're fine for appearances," she replied, adjusting a vase. "But this family has standards. You can help with the dessert coordination, yes?" "Of course. Help. My role eternal and unpaid." "Sure," I murmured, grabbing a clipboard. Through the open doors, I caught a glimpse of Vanessa posing for photos in her rehearsal gown. The afternoon light poured through the French windows, haloing her blonde hair. She looked every inch the golden daughter, laughing, graceful, perfectly adored. Beside her, Mother beamed as though she'd just curated an exhibition masterpiece. I stood at the edge, holding a list of desserts, like a stagehand who'd stumbled onto the wrong play. Guests began arriving for the rehearsal dinner that evening. The vineyard glowed in warm, amber light wine glasses, catching sunset like fire. As I arranged seating cards, I overheard two women whispering near the bar. "The younger sister is marrying into the Donovans," one said, clearly impressed. "And the older one, I think she's helping with catering." Their laughter was soft, polite, lethal. I kept my eyes down, aligning name tags until the edges were perfect. Every time I thought I'd outgrown this humiliation, my family found new ways to remind me I hadn't. Rachel, Mother called, waving me over to check the dessert table. "The pastry layout looks uneven." "It's fine," I said, too tired to pretend. Her smile thinned. "Vanessa's fiancé's family is here tonight. Do try to look professional." "I am professional." "Then act like it," she snapped, before gliding away. I inhaled slowly, counting to 5. It was always the same praise for Vanessa's charm, criticism for my existence. The only difference now was that I finally had something they couldn't take: a meeting in San Francisco that could change my life. But that was my secret. Later in the kitchen, the head planner mistook me for part of the hired staff. "Can you help polish the glassware?" she asked. "Of course," I said with a small smile, and did it without correcting her. There was no point. My family had already written that script years ago. As I worked, a man's voice floated in from the adjoining hall, low, measured with a trace of amusement. "You've got them running like a campaign rally, not a wedding." Curious, I stepped out just far enough to see who was speaking. A tall man in a charcoal suit stood near the doorway, observing the chaos with faint interest. His sleeves were rolled up, tie loosened. He looked out of place amid the designer, perfection, calm, deliberate, as if nothing here could impress or intimidate him. Our eyes met for a brief moment. "Are you with the planning team?" he asked. "Something like that," I replied, tucking a loose strand of hair behind my ear. He smiled, and I felt a strange tug of recognition. "You have an eye for detail," he said. "The table arrangement, it's symmetrical, but not rigid. That takes instinct." "Thank you," I murmured, uncertain what else to say. He glanced toward the main hall. "I'm told the Groom's family is quite the powerhouse." "They are," I said, then paused. "And you are?" He hesitated just long enough to make it feel intentional. "Elliot," he said, finally extending his hand. "A friend of the Donovans." When I shook his hand, there was a flicker, firm, steady, curious. His eyes lingered a moment, longer than polite, before someone called his name. "Mr. Ward, we need you in the tasting room." Ward. The name hit me like a quiet explosion. Elliot Ward. He nodded politely and disappeared through the doorway. I stood there, frozen, the name echoing in my head. The CEO of Ward Industries, my would-be client, the man whose company had vanished from our email threads months ago, was a friend of the Donovans, my sister's in-laws. A chill ran through me, colder than the wine I'd been pouring all day. That night I stayed late to oversee the dessert setup, unable to shake the thought. Mother's voice echoed in the next room, laughing with Vanessa and the Donovans, every sound of it polished and false. I remembered the Horizon proposal we'd sent to Ward Industries, the one Elizabeth and I had poured months into, and the strange silence afterward. What if someone had intercepted it? I stared at the seating chart, suddenly noticing something odd. The name Elliot Ward was handwritten, added last minute. His seat was at the head table, right beside the groom's father. A twist of suspicion settled in my stomach. "Rachel," a voice interrupted. Vanessa leaned against the doorway, holding a champagne flute. "Mother says to make sure the napkins match the floral palette. Ivory, not cream." I didn't turn. "They're already ivory." She smiled sweetly, the kind of smile that always hid claws. "I'm just making sure. We can't afford mistakes tomorrow." "Don't worry, Vanessa. I've spent my whole life cleaning up your messes. Her smile faltered for a second, then returned sharper. You've always had such a temper. That's why people prefer me. I looked up then, meeting her eyes. People prefer masks. You just wear yours better. For a heartbeat, her composure cracked. Then she laughed softly. Good night, Rachel. Try not to embarrass the family tomorrow. When she left, the silence that followed felt like smoke, thick and suffocating. By midnight, the vineyard had gone quiet. I walked out to the terrace overlooking the valley. Rows of grapevines shimmered silver under the moonlight, a perfect backdrop for a perfect wedding. I closed my eyes, breathing in the stillness. Tomorrow, Mother would parade Vanessa like a trophy. Tomorrow, I'd play the part of invisible support once again. But something in me had shifted since that email, since that look in Elliot Ward's eyes. For the first time, I wasn't content being background noise. As I turned to go inside, I caught my reflection in the glass door, tired eyes, wine-stained fingertips, but steady. Behind me, the ballroom glowed like a dream I no longer wanted to belong to. I whispered to the reflection, tomorrow they'll remember my name. And though I didn't know how I felt the truth of it, the stage was set. The lights were ready. All it needed was one moment, one mistake to turn the script upside down. The night wind rustled through the vines as if it already knew what was coming. The string quartet played something delicate and expensive, the kind of music that floated just above conversation without ever daring to interrupt it. I stood by the champagne tower, the weight of the tray biting into my wrist, trying to keep my smile steady while laughter rippled around the hall. The wedding had begun exactly as my mother planned, elegant, extravagant, and suffocating. Every corner of Silvercrest Vineyard glimmered under soft gold light. The guests shimmered in silk and jewelry, and I moved among them like a shadow in black. Rachel, be careful with that, Mother murmured as she swept past perfume trailing behind her like judgment. We can't afford any mistakes tonight. I've managed entire galas for heads of state, Mom, I said, my voice quiet. She didn't hear or didn't care. She was already turning toward a cluster of donors, her laughter polished and hollow. This is our Rachel, she announced. She's helping with the serving. A few guests smiled at me, polite but pitying, the kind of look reserved for someone who tried and failed to make something of themselves. My throat tightened, but I held my head high and walked toward the head table, the tray balanced perfectly. Vanessa was glowing under the chandelier, her diamond earrings catching the light. Her groom leaned toward her, whispering something that made her laugh, a sound I used to love when we were girls before it became a weapon. I moved slower, the tray trembling slightly. It wasn't the weight, it was the humiliation. Every compliment I'd ever earned, every sleepless night building my company, reduced to a single line, she's helping. I took one careful step backward to steady myself. The hem of my dress snagged on the leg of a chair. My balance faltered. The tray tilted. Time fractured. A glass of red wine slipped, spiraled, and exploded against a gray vest. The music died. I froze. The smell of wine and panic filled the air. Guests gasped. The groom blinked. My mother's voice sliced through the silence. Rachel, I turned and met the startled eyes of the man I'd spent months trying to reach. Elliot Ward. The CEO of Ward Industries stood before me, his once pristine shirt now blooming crimson. He blinked down at it, then up at me. I waited for anger, for the fury of someone humiliated in public. Instead, his mouth curved into the faintest smile. It's fine, he said, his tone calm, almost amused. I'm so sorry, I stammered, grabbing napkins. I didn't mean. He stopped me with a raised hand. No harm done. His voice was steady, confident. Red suits me better anyway. The crowd exhaled as one. A few awkward chuckles rippled through the room. My mother stepped forward, clutching Vanessa's arm like a lifeline. Oh, Mr. Ward, please forgive her. She's always been a little clumsy. She's just helping tonight. Elliot turned his gaze on her, polite but cool. Helping, interesting word. Then his eyes returned to me. Rachel Monroe, right? I blinked. Yes. He extended his hand, still smiling. We've been trying to reach you for months. Your proposal for the Horizon Gala, it was exceptional. The room froze again, but this time for a different reason. My heart hammered in my chest. You saw that? Of course, he said easily. We've been planning our national campaign, and your ideas for multi-city branding were the best we reviewed. I assumed you'd lost interest since we never heard back. I never got any response, I managed. I thought, that's strange, he said, his smile sharpening slightly. Our messages went to your company domain. His eyes flicked toward the head table where Vanessa's new father-in-law sat lips tight. Perhaps they got lost in someone's inbox. My mother's face paled. Well, that's business for you. Things get lost sometimes. Apparently, Elliot replied, not taking his eyes off her. Then he looked back at me. In any case, I'm glad fate intervened. My assistant will reach out Monday morning to finalize details. I tried to speak, but my throat had closed. All I could do was nod. He smiled again. And Rachel, yes. Next time, let's skip the wine bath. Though I must admit, it made an unforgettable first impression. Laughter rolled through the hall, light and genuine. Someone clapped. The tension broke like glass underfoot. Elliot winked once, then turned to the groom's father, starting a new conversation as if nothing had happened. I stood there, frozen napkins limp in my hand, the air suddenly too bright. My mother's lips parted, her expression carved in disbelief. Vanessa's face was unreadable, a flicker of jealousy beneath her practiced smile. I set the tray down and walked away before anyone could stop me. The hallway outside was dim, cooler, the hum of music muffled behind the doors. My hands were shaking, but not from shame. Not anymore. I pushed open the side door and stepped out onto the terrace. The vineyard stretched before me under a sky littered with stars. The air smelled of grapes and wet soil. I leaned against the stone railing, breathing deep, letting the cool wind cut through the leftover humiliation. Behind me, laughter resumed, but it sounded different now, less like triumph, more like confusion. For once, I wasn't the one being laughed at. I stared down at my stained dress, a deep red patch spreading across the black fabric. The color looked almost deliberate, like armor. Footsteps sounded behind me. I turned. Elliot Ward stood a few feet away, his jacket draped over one arm. I hope I didn't startle you, he said. No, I answered. You just surprised me. Again. He chuckled. Occupational hazard. I'm glad I got to meet the woman behind Luna Events. Your work speaks for itself. I didn't realize you even knew who I was, I said, my voice quieter now. I make it a point to know excellence when I see it, he said simply. I wasn't sure what to say to that. Compliments usually bounced off me, they had to. But his tone wasn't flattery, it was acknowledgement. Something I hadn't felt from my own family in decades. You handled yourself well in there, he added. Most people would have hidden. I've been hiding my whole life, I said, before I could stop myself. He studied me for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Don't. You have nothing to hide from. The words settled over me like a steady hand. He glanced toward the lights of the ballroom. You know, he said, your proposal had one line I underlined 3 times. Luxury isn't about prestige, it's about belonging. I liked that. You should believe it for yourself, too. I smiled faintly. Thank you. He nodded once. See you Monday, Miss Monroe? Then he walked back inside, leaving me with the night and the quiet hum of possibility. For a long time I stayed on that terrace, watching the stars blur and refocus. I thought about all the years I'd let them decide who I was. My mother's scorn, Vanessa's easy perfection, the endless need to prove myself, and how a single stupid accident had shattered that glass ceiling in one breath. When I finally went back inside, the party was winding down. My mother was still fuming in whispers, Vanessa pretending to comfort her. Father stood in the corner staring into his drink, face unreadable. As I walked past them, Mother hissed under her breath, "You've embarrassed us for the last time." I paused. "Funny," I said quietly. "I think I just did the opposite." She froze, speechless. I smiled politely and kept walking. Outside, the valet handed me my keys. The night air was cool and smelled faintly of wine and dust. As I started the engine, I caught a glimpse of Elliot through the window speaking with Vanessa's in-laws. He looked up once as if sensing me and gave the smallest nod. Driving down the dark road lined with vines, I realized my hands weren't trembling anymore. The humiliation had burned away, leaving something solid behind. Not pride, exactly, something older, sharper. "This is the last time I serve anyone," I whispered, echoing the promise I'd made the night before. The vineyard lights faded behind me, swallowed by the dark hills. Ahead, the road stretched open and endless, like the first clean page of a story I was finally ready to write. The email from Ward Industries arrived at dawn. I was already awake, staring at the ceiling of my apartment while the city outside blurred through morning rain. Subject: Horizon Contract Proposal. Follow-up Monday, 10:00 a.m. I read it twice, heart-hammering, then rolled out of bed and opened my laptop. Elizabeth had beaten me to it. A message blinked from her. "You ready? I want to fly down early. This is our shot, Rachel." By the time our plane landed in San Francisco, the sky had turned the color of polished steel. Ward Tower rose from the fog like something out of another world, 40 floors of mirrored glass and power. Inside the lobby, I caught my reflection, tailored navy suit, steady posture, hands trembling just slightly. I wasn't the invisible daughter tonight. I was the CEO of Luna Events. Elliot Ward greeted us in the executive boardroom. He looked nothing like the man I'd doused in Merlot 3 nights ago. Crisp charcoal suit, calm authority, eyes sharp but kind. "Miss Monroe," he said, shaking my hand. "Glad you made it." "Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Ward. Elliot, please." His smile reached his eyes this time. "You've already made quite the impression." Around the table sat 7 board members, the kind of people who carried empires in their briefcases. The meeting began with questions, numbers, projections. Elizabeth handled logistics. I spoke about creative vision. I walked them through the 5-city rollout plan, the thematic unity of color and experience. Every slide, every word carried months of my life. When I finished, Elliot leaned back, studying me. "Gentlemen," he said, "this is why Luna Events will lead Horizon's national rebrand." The room burst into applause. I glanced at Elizabeth. She squeezed my hand under the table, her grin unrestrained. As we left the tower later that afternoon, sunlight caught on the mirrored walls, scattering brightness across the marble floor. Elliot's assistant caught up to us near the elevator. "Miss Ward said to confirm the signing ceremony for Monday next week." I barely breathed the whole elevator ride down. Outside, the city pulsed with energy. Cars, people, motion. I felt weightless. After 15 years of building something from scratch, I'd finally made it. That night I couldn't sleep. Success didn't feel like I expected. It felt fragile, like glass balanced on my fingertips. The next morning, while I was pouring coffee in the Luna Events kitchen, James rushed in, face pale. "We have a problem," he said, slamming his laptop on the counter. "What kind of problem?" He turned the screen toward me. "From Ward Financial Oversight. Subject: Urgent discrepancies found in Luna Events accounting." The email was short, formal, and devastating: claims of falsified tax returns, vendor overbilling, a request for immediate clarification. My stomach dropped. Where did this come from? "The domain looks real," James said, frowning. "But it's not Ward's actual server. It's a clone. Somebody spoofed it." Elizabeth entered, half-dressed for a meeting, hair still damp. "What's going on?" I handed her the laptop. She read, jaw tightening. "Who knew about the contract timeline?" "Only the 3 of us," I said. "And the board at Ward Industries." James scrolled down. "The attachments are fake. Look." He clicked a link. The report listed financial discrepancies we'd never had, referencing vendors who didn't exist. "Someone wants this to look real," Elizabeth said. The phone on my desk buzzed. Unknown number. When I answered, my mother's voice filled the line, sugar and venom. "Rachel, what are you doing?" Ward's legal department called me. "They said your company's under investigation for fraud." I gripped the phone tighter. Why would they call you? Because we're your family. They're asking about background. I told them you were overextended, maybe a bit unstable. I nearly dropped the phone. You did what you should have, let Vanessa help you. She has the right connections. I only wanted to protect you from embarrassing yourself. I hung up before I said something unforgivable. My hand shook as I set the phone down. Elizabeth's eyes widened. She's behind it, not just her, I said. Vanessa too. The timing's too perfect. They want to ruin the contract before it's signed. That evening the rain returned. I sat by the office window watching headlights smear across wet pavement. The city's glow reflected in the glass like 1,000 watchful eyes. Elizabeth brought me tea, setting it gently beside my hand. We can fix this, she said. James will trace the source. James leaned in the doorway, exhausted but determined. We'll find them, Rachel. Nobody fabricates financial data without leaving a trail. I nodded, though I didn't feel steady. They've been doing it for years, I just never saw it. Elizabeth's voice softened. Then maybe it's time you stopped surviving and started fighting. By midnight, the office was silent except for the hum of servers. I opened my email again, staring at the fake report, the falsified numbers that looked too real. My company, my life reduced to a weapon in someone else's hands. I printed the file, spread it across the conference table, and marked each inconsistency with a red pen. Every forged line was an act of war. The next day I flew back to Napa for Vanessa's post-wedding brunch, though every instinct screamed not to. If they wanted to play this game, I needed to look them in the eye. The vineyard glittered with champagne and laughter, the scent of roses cloying in the heat. Vanessa spotted me first, her smile pure sugar. Rachel, you came. I always do, I said, brushing past her. Mother appeared elegant as ever, pretending not to notice the tension crackling between us. Darling, I heard about your little business hiccup. So unfortunate. These things happen when people rush. It's handled, I said evenly. Vanessa tilted her head. Ward Industries must be nervous. I'd be too. A national contract is a big responsibility. I met her gaze. Funny, you seem very interested in my business for someone who's supposedly supportive. She laughed softly. I just care, that's all. Family looks out for each other. I smiled, though my teeth ached. That's one word for it. When I left the vineyard that afternoon, the air was thick with unspoken things. I drove straight to the airport, mind spinning. Every memory from childhood, the dismissive glances, the whispered jokes, fit into a new pattern now. They weren't just indifferent, they were deliberate. Back in Seattle, James met me at the office with a grim expression. You were right, he said. The fake email came from a PR firm in Los Angeles, Monroe Communications. My breath caught. Vanessa's company, he nodded. And the domain registry traces back to your mother's charitable foundation. They funded it. For a long time, none of us spoke. The only sound was the faint buzz of the city below. Elizabeth finally broke the silence. They've gone too far. You can't let this slide. I looked out the window at the skyline, the towers glowing like watchtowers. No, I said quietly. I won't. That night, I sat alone at my desk, staring at the evidence on the screen. Rage came in waves, cold and sharp. But under it, something steadier began to form, resolve. They wanted to destroy me before I could rise. They'd underestimated how high I was willing to climb. By dawn, I'd drafted my first move. A quiet investigation, a controlled response. And when the time came a reckoning, I shut off the lights, locking the office behind me. The hallway echoed with my footsteps, crisp and sure. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like the daughter who had to earn her place. I felt like the woman who was about to take it back. The phone rang just after sunrise, slicing through the quiet hum of my office. I'd been there all night, surrounded by stacks of invoices, vendor logs, and 3 empty coffee cups. Elizabeth's voice came through the speaker, tight and urgent. Rachel, the health department just showed up. Again. I closed my eyes for a second. Which location? Downtown. They said they got an anonymous complaint about food handling at last night's fundraiser. My chest tightened. That's the third one in 2 months. I know. And they keep using the same phrasing, concerned family member. I pushed back from the desk, gripping the edge until my knuckles ached. They're not even trying to hide it anymore. By the time I reached the office, Kitchen 2 inspectors were already packing up their clipboards. All clean, one of them said. Like always. But maybe you should tell your competitor to stop wasting our time. Competitor. I almost laughed. After they left, Elizabeth appeared in the doorway, her face pale. They're escalating. Someone wants to leave a trail of smoke. They're leaving more than that, I said, pulling up my inbox. 2 new messages blinked from vendors we'd worked with for years, contracts under review due to reputational concerns. One of them, Martinelli's Linens, had supplied us since our first event. I called immediately. Rachel, I hate this, Martinelli said. We got a call from someone claiming to work with your sister's PR firm. They said Luna Events might be facing legal trouble. We just can't risk it right now. My voice came out steadier than I felt. I understand. Thank you for telling me. After I hung up, I stared at the skyline beyond the window. The city lights flickered in the gray morning haze. I'd built this business from nothing, every client, every relationship, every late night, and now they were slicing through it piece by piece. Elizabeth set a folder on my desk. We need to document everything. Every inspection, every call, every rumor. I opened it. Each tab was color-coded, labeled with dates and cross-references. You've been keeping records, of course, she said. I've seen patterns for months, but I needed you to see them too. The folder was a map of betrayal. Dates lined up perfectly, with family gatherings, mother's charity galas, Vanessa's PR events, even my father's birthday. After each one, there was a flare of interference, vendor cancellations, anonymous complaints, lost proposals. I flipped to the last page, my throat tightening. The latest entry was from last week, the fake financial report sent to Ward Industries. Elizabeth watched me carefully. They're trying to make Horizon pull the contract before it's signed. They won't, I said. Not if I get ahead of them. James arrived an hour later, still in his trench coat, a folder under his arm. You're going to want to see this, he said, spreading out papers across the conference table. I tracked the source of the anonymous complaints. They were filed through a digital proxy, but the payment for the proxy service came from a Monroe family account. Which one? I asked. Margaret's foundation fund. For a moment the room tilted. I steadied myself against the table. My mother's charitable foundation, the one she used for public donations and PR appearances, was financing a smear campaign against her own daughter. James continued, his voice calm and deliberate. It's sophisticated. Multiple intermediaries. But the pattern's clear. Elizabeth folded her arms. They're panicking. The closer we get to the Horizon signing, the more desperate they become. I stared down at the paper trail, my jaw tight. Then let's stop playing defense. We worked through the morning, cross-checking every document, compiling evidence. By noon, my desk looked like a battlefield of paper and red pen marks. The deeper we dug, the more obvious the pattern became. It wasn't incompetence, it was war. At one point, Elizabeth looked up from her notes. When did it start? I didn't have to think long. The year I signed my first major client, Mother congratulated me with a bottle of wine and a warning about ambition. James frowned. Ambition. She said women like us should be careful not to overreach. That success makes people uncomfortable. I gave a hollow laugh. I guess she decided to make sure of it. Elizabeth reached across the table, touching my hand. You're not going to let her win. No, I said softly. I'm going to make her watch me win. That afternoon I called a meeting. Every department head at Luna Events packed into the conference room, catering, logistics, design. Their faces were tired but loyal. They'd seen the rumors online, the inspectors, the sudden questions from clients. I stood at the front, shoulders square. You've probably heard things, I began. Rumors about audits, financial issues, instability. None of it's true, but it's not random either. It's sabotage, and it's coming from people who think they can break us because we're small, because we're led by a woman who doesn't know her place. The room went silent. Then Elizabeth spoke up. We're doubling down. Every project, every detail perfection. Let them look. We'll give them nothing but excellence. A murmur of agreement spread around the table. I caught James's approving nod. When the meeting ended, I lingered by the window watching my reflection blur against the rain-streaked glass. I barely recognized the woman staring back. Not the dutiful daughter, not the invisible helper. Someone harder now, sharper. Elizabeth came to stand beside me. You need rest, she said quietly. I'll rest when this is over. She studied me a moment longer, then smiled. I've seen that look before. Right before you land the impossible deal. I smiled back, but it didn't reach my eyes. This time, the deal is survival. That night, the storm outside deepened. I stayed at the office, pacing between the windows and the glowing computer screens. James left me a stack of legal templates. Elizabeth had gone home to check on the Horizon documentation. Alone, I could almost hear the ghosts of every past humiliation. The laughter, the introductions, the endless word, helping. I walked to the kitchen, poured a cup of stale coffee, and stared at the city below. My phone buzzed again, another unknown number. I almost didn't answer. Rachel? It was Vanessa. What do you want? I said flatly. Her voice trembled just enough to sound practiced. You're making a mistake going after Mother like this. She was only trying to protect you. From what? From embarrassing yourself. Ward Industries doesn't care about you. You're not ready for that level. I laughed softly. You sound just like her. Because she's right, she said quickly. You've always been impulsive, emotional. Funny, I replied. Those emotions built a company you've been trying to destroy for years. A pause. Then she said quietly, You can't win against us. The line went dead. I stared at the phone, my pulse steady. Then I deleted the call record, filed the number into our evidence log, and opened a blank document titled Retaliation Plan. By the time dawn broke, the file was 6 pages long, timelines, names, proof. Every false rumor, every sabotaged contract, every fabricated complaint. I added one final note at the bottom, deliver to Ward Industries legal if interference continues. When Elizabeth walked in that morning with fresh coffee, she took one look at my face and said, You found your war face. I smiled, slow and cold. No, I found my purpose. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the city gleaming and raw. The sunlight caught on the Luna Events sign outside the window, the letters blazing gold against the glass. For the first time I saw it for what it really was, not a company name but a declaration. I whispered to the empty office. They think they built me on obedience. But they built me on endurance. And as the light filled the room, I knew the next move wouldn't be defense. It would be attack. The morning of the Ward Industries signing ceremony dawned clear and cold, a strange calm after weeks of storms. I stood in front of the mirror in my apartment, adjusting the cuff of my navy blazer. For once, I looked exactly how I felt, composed, deliberate, untouchable. The Horizon contract would change everything. It wasn't just business, it was proof. Elizabeth met me in the lobby of our building, clutching her tablet. Presentation files are loaded. James has the financial packet. Perfect, I said. Let's go win this. The drive to San Francisco was quiet, both of us running through mental checklists. When the Ward Tower came into view, sunlight glinting off its glass, I felt my pulse steady. I'd imagined this moment 1,000 times, the meeting where I finally stood across from people who valued merit over lineage. Inside the boardroom, the air buzzed with restrained excitement. Elliot Ward greeted us with that same easy confidence that seemed to make everyone else lean in. Rachel, he said, shaking my hand, I've been looking forward to this. So have I. He motioned toward the long table surrounded by his team. Let's make it official. For 2 hours, we reviewed details: the national rollout schedule, budgets, branding strategy. Elliot's team listened intently, nodding, asking sharp questions. Every answer I gave built a bridge toward legitimacy I'd fought years to cross. When the last slide faded from the projector, Elliot smiled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is exactly the partnership we've been waiting for." Applause filled the room. I exhaled, tension finally releasing from my shoulders. "Paperwork will be ready for signatures by Monday," Elliot said, closing his folder. "You've done remarkable work, Rachel." As we shook hands, his assistant approached with a discreet smile. "Mr. Ward, your 11:30 call." He nodded. "Go celebrate," he said to me. "You've earned it." Elizabeth and I stepped into the elevator, hearts racing. "We did it," she whispered. But the victory was short-lived. That evening, while reviewing client emails at my hotel desk, a notification appeared on my screen. Subject: urgent discrepancies in Luna Events financial reporting. The sender was familiar: Ward Financial Oversight. My breath caught. Another fake. I clicked anyway. Attached was a report accusing Luna Events of falsifying vendor payments, complete with fabricated figures and forged signatures. Before I could process, my phone rang. "Rachel, it's James," his voice tight. "You need to see what's trending." He texted me a link. A blog post already spreading: insider claims Luna Events facing audit over fraud allegations. The blood drained from my face. Elizabeth burst into my room minutes later, hair disheveled, phone in hand. "They're at it again," she said. "Same language, same formatting. Someone sent this directly to the Ward board. It looks official. They're trying to sabotage the contract," I said, voice low, right before the signing. Before she could answer, my phone buzzed again. "Unknown number." "Rachel Monroe," I said. My mother's voice smooth as ever. "You shouldn't have gone behind family, darling. Ward called me tonight, asked if you're mentally fit to handle a national rollout. I told them you've been under stress." They seemed concerned. My stomach turned to ice. "You're calling them now. I'm saving you," she said. "From humiliation." I hung up. My reflection in the dark window didn't look like me anymore. It looked like someone standing at the edge of war. By morning, the damage had spread. Vendors were calling, worried. Clients wanted reassurances. Reporters emailed questions. In the Luna office, Elizabeth slammed a stack of printouts onto my desk. "Look at this. 3 vendors withdrew today. 2 more postponed payments, all because of this fake audit story." James entered, pale and furious. "And it gets worse." I traced the metadata on the file they sent Ward. It was uploaded from an IP address registered to Monroe Communications. My pulse pounded in my ears. "Vanessa," Elizabeth's voice was cold. "And your mother funded the domain. Again." I sank into my chair, gripping the edge until my nails dug into wood. "They don't even want money," I said slowly. "They just want to erase me." James leaned forward. "Then stop letting them write the story." At noon, we gathered the core team. The mood was somber but focused. I stood at the front of the conference room, flanked by Elizabeth and James, and spoke without notes. "Someone wants to destroy what we've built," I said. "They've used lies, rumors, and manipulation. But we're still standing because truth doesn't shake. From this moment, we go silent publicly. No reactions, no panic. Every question gets routed to me. Internally, we prepare a full transparency audit. If they want to dig, we'll give them the cleanest records they've ever seen." Elizabeth nodded. "I'll handle the press angle. You handle Ward." That evening, my phone buzzed again. "Elliot Ward." I answered immediately. "Rachel," he said, calm but firm. "We received troubling communications today." "I know," I said quickly. "They're false. I can prove it." "I believe you," he said, "but the board wants confirmation. They'll hold an internal review before Monday." The floor seemed to tilt beneath me. "You're postponing the signing for now. Don't lose faith. We'll get through this." After the call, I sat in silence. Elizabeth watched me from the doorway. "What did he say?" "They're freezing the deal." She walked over and placed a hand on my shoulder. Then we show them what real integrity looks like. For the next 2 days, we barely slept. James cross-checked every bank statement, every invoice. Elizabeth contacted vendors for written testimonials. I drafted a presentation titled, Luna Events Full Transparency Report. By Sunday morning, the evidence filled 3 binders. But there was one thing still missing, a direct link tying the sabotage to my family. Proof they couldn't deny. While James printed the last pages, Elizabeth's phone buzzed. She frowned. Rachel, someone's calling from an unknown number. Same prefix as your hometown. Put it on speaker. Static filled the room, then a man's voice, hesitant, young. Miss Monroe, my name's Jake. I worked the bar at your sister's wedding. I think you should know something. Elizabeth and I exchanged a glance. Go on, I said. There were cameras near the terrace security footage. I still have access. There's a clip you should see. It's your sister and your mother talking about you. About Ward. They said they'd already sent emails to make sure Rachel never gets that contract. I didn't understand then, but my breath caught. You still have it? Yes, ma'am. I can send it now. Do it, I said. 10 minutes later, the file appeared in my inbox. Elizabeth hit play. The audio crackled, then cleared, Vanessa's voice bright and cruel. Ward will never sign with her once we plant the doubts. I told Mother to make it look like a financial discrepancy. Then my mother good. Make it believable. Rachel's too naive to think we'd ever stand in her way. The recording ended. Silence filled the room. Elizabeth looked at me, eyes wide. That's it. That's our proof. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. The rage that rose inside me wasn't hot anymore. It was cold, precise, steady. They've spent 15 years trying to make me small, I said quietly. Now I'm going to make sure the world sees exactly who they are. James closed the folder in front of him. What's your next move? I stood, sliding the USB drive into my pocket. I'm done hiding. They want to play public. Let's go public. Elizabeth's lips curved into a fierce smile. Where? At the Country Club Charity Gala, this Friday, I said. Mother's event. She invited half the city's elite. You're going to confront them there. Yes, I said. In front of everyone they ever tried to impress. The wind outside rattled against the glass. I could see my reflection in the dark window, steady, unafraid, no longer waiting for permission. Prepare the visuals, I told Elizabeth. Jake's recording the emails, the vendor statements. We'll turn their own tactics into a mirror, she nodded. And after that, I said, we start over, without them. As I switched off the office lights, the city stretched below like a field of stars, cold, distant, beautiful. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was standing in their shadow. I was standing in my own light. The next morning, the city woke under a haze of gray, but I felt sharper than I had in weeks. The recording from Jake looped in my mind as I sat in my office, the words of my mother and sister echoing like static. Make it believable. Rachel's too naive to think we'd ever stand in her way. Not anymore. Elizabeth arrived early, 2 cups of coffee in hand. I didn't sleep, she admitted. Kept thinking about what we're about to do. Neither did I. I took the cup, my voice steady. But this time, it's not about survival. It's about ending this. We spread the documents across the conference table, emails, financial statements, the transcript of the recording. James joined us, carrying a folder thicker than I expected. I finished the analysis, he said. They've been coordinating this for years. I tracked identical patterns of interference going back 15 contracts, always the same timing, right after family events. I flipped through the pages, every red mark a scar. They made sure every victory was temporary. I kept thinking I wasn't good enough. Elizabeth placed a hand on mine. You were just fighting ghosts you couldn't see. A knock on the glass made us look up. Jake stood hesitantly in the doorway, a hoodie pulled tight around his face. You said to come by. Yes, I said, gesturing him in. And thank you for sending that recording. He nodded nervously. I didn't know what they were talking about then, but when the fake stories started showing up online, I thought someone needs to know. You did the right thing, I said. We'll keep your name out of everything. He looked relieved. There's more, by the way. The security feed wasn't just audio, there's video too. You can see them with a phone and a laptop. Timestamp matches the night before that email blast. Elizabeth leaned forward. Do you still have it? Jake handed me a flash drive. It's all there. I don't want anything. I hate seeing people get crushed by lies. I met his eyes. You just helped make sure they don't. After he left, we plugged in the drive. The video was grainy but clear enough. My mother and Vanessa sitting on the terrace outside the rehearsal, dinner glasses of wine in hand. My mother leaned forward, whispering something while Vanessa typed on her phone. Then the words we'd already heard. Send it from the firm's domain. Make sure the headers match. Elizabeth exhaled. This is bulletproof. James nodded. If you take this towards legal team, they'll drop the investigation immediately. I sat back in my chair, staring at the paused frame of my mother's face, composed, confident, cruel. Not yet, I said. If we go legal first, they'll spin it as a misunderstanding. I want the truth seen for what it is, in their own world. Elizabeth tilted her head. The gala, yes. The charity event. Friday night. Every major investor, politician, and journalist will be there. We'll give them the show they've always craved, just not the one they expect. James looked wary. That's risky. Necessary, I said. They built their power in rooms like that. It's time those rooms see the truth. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. Elizabeth coordinated with our IT team to extract the clearest segments of audio and video. James compiled a financial dossier tracing every act of interference back to my mother's foundation. I spent my nights crafting a presentation that wasn't just evidence, it was a story. Mine. On Thursday evening, Elliot called. Rachel, how are you holding up? Focused, I said. He hesitated before speaking again. I saw the recording you sent earlier. That's damning. I'm not done, I told him. I need one more day. Be careful, he said quietly. They'll come after you harder once they realize what you've found. They already have, I said. But this time I'm not alone. He paused, then his tone softened. When this is over, I'd like to talk about something bigger than the Horizon contract. I smiled faintly. Let's survive Friday first. Friday arrived bright and deceptively calm. The air outside the Luna Events office smelled of rain and magnolia. Inside, everything was motion. Elizabeth printing last-minute copies, James verifying timestamps, our AV specialist testing the video reel one final time. By late afternoon, the evidence was sealed in a black leather portfolio marked confidential. As I stood by the window watching the sky darken, Elizabeth joined me. You sure about this? Once we do it, there's no taking it back. I've spent 15 years cleaning their messes, I said. This time they can clean their own, she smiled. Then, let's give them a night they'll never forget. We arrived at the Emerald Bay Country Club just after 7. The parking lot sparkled with luxury cars, photographers snapping pictures at the entrance. Inside, chandeliers threw golden light across marble floors. I spotted my mother immediately, crimson dress pearls, the kind of poise that could pass for grace if you didn't know her. Vanessa stood nearby, radiant, and rehearsed laughing with a group of donors. I walked in beside Elizabeth, head high, my black evening gown understated but sharp. Conversations dimmed slightly when people recognized me. The tension was delicious. Mother's smile froze when she saw me. Rachel, she said, voice brittle. You came. I was invited, I said. Wouldn't miss it. She glanced at Elizabeth beside me, then at the leather portfolio under my arm. You're not here to cause trouble, I hope. Tonight's about charity. Don't worry, I said, smiling. It'll be unforgettable charity. Elliot arrived moments later, greeting me with a quiet nod. His presence at my side drew curious looks from nearby guests and a flash of panic in Vanessa's eyes. When the dinner ended and the speeches began, my mother took the stage. Tonight we celebrate generosity, she said, her voice carrying across the hall. Because family, after all, is the root of every legacy. As the applause began, I rose from my seat. You're right, I said loud enough to cut through the noise. Family is legacy. That's why it's important to tell the truth about it. The room fell silent. Rachel's mother hissed, "Sit down," but I didn't. I stepped toward the podium, portfolio in hand. I have something to share, something my family has kept hidden for far too long. Elliot signaled to the technician in the back. The lights dimmed. The first clip played on the large projection screen, Vanessa's voice cold and unmistakable. Ward will never sign with her once we plant the doubts. A ripple of gasps swept through the crowd. My mother rose to her feet, pale. This is manipulation. Is it? I said calmly. Because here's more. The second clip began the video of them on the terrace, wine glasses glinting under candlelight. Make it believable. Rachel's too naive to think we'd ever stand in her way. Every sound in the room vanished except for the recording. When it ended, silence hung heavy as smoke. I turned to face them both. For 15 years you called me ungrateful, dramatic, difficult. You told everyone I couldn't handle success. But the truth is you were terrified I might actually earn it. Mother tried to speak, but no words came. Vanessa's lips trembled, eyes darting toward the exit. Elliot stepped forward. For those wondering, Ward Industries has verified the authenticity of these recordings. The false reports against Luna events originated from Monroe Communications. The crowd murmured shock, disapproval, pity. Margaret Monroe's flawless image cracked like glass. I closed the portfolio and met her eyes one last time. You taught me to serve Mother. Tonight I'm serving the truth. Then I walked off the stage. Outside, the night air felt electric. Elizabeth caught up to me, her eyes wide. You just detonated their empire. Good, I said quietly. They built it on lies. We stood there under the glow of the club's lanterns, listening as chaos erupted behind the doors, reporters shouting questions, cameras flashing. For once, I didn't flinch. Elliot joined us a moment later, his expression unreadable. You realize, he said softly, that was one of the most ruthless things I've ever seen. I smiled faintly. Then I learned from the best. He laughed under his breath. You've just rewritten your own story, Rachel. I glanced back at the building where my mother's name once commanded respect and now drew whispers. No, I said. I finally started telling it. The wind picked up, carrying the faint hum of shattered applause. Somewhere deep inside, the part of me that had been waiting for their approval finally went silent. What replaced it wasn't vengeance. It was peace sharpened into purpose. Let's go home, I said. As we walked to the car, Elizabeth slipped her arm through mine. So what happens now? Now, I said, looking back at the club one last time, they live in the truth they created. The doors shut behind us with a satisfying echo. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the servant at the edge of the room. I felt like the one who'd turned on the lights. The chandeliers trembled with light as the room fell into a stunned, fragile silence. For a moment, all I could hear was the faint clinking of a dropped fork somewhere near the back. Then the whispers began, small at first, then swelling like a rising tide. Did she say her mother? Is that true? Oh my God! My mother's crimson dress seemed to drain of color as she stood frozen on the stage, the microphone still in her hand. Her lips parted, but no words came. Vanessa looked around wildly, the practiced calm on her face shattering as cameras started to flash. Elliot stood just off stage, beside me, arms folded, his presence steady as a mountain. It's your floor now, he murmured. I stepped forward. This isn't about humiliation, I said, voice carrying clear through the microphone. It's about truth. About what happens when family becomes your first enemy and reputation becomes their only god. The crowd quieted again, their faces a mix of sympathy and fascination. My mother finally found her voice. You're mistaken, Rachel, she said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. You've been under enormous stress. None of this is true, I finished for her. Then perhaps you should listen to yourself. The screen behind me came alive again this time, showing the second half of the video. My mother's voice filled the hall clear as crystal. Send it from the firm's domain. Make sure the headers match. Ward trusts consistency. Gasps erupted around the room. A woman in the front row covered her mouth. The president of a local charity actually stood up, staring at my mother in disbelief. I turned, facing her. You taught me appearances are everything. Tonight I'm simply following your example, putting on a show. She reached for the microphone, but Elliot blocked her path with a polite, professional smile. Mrs. Monroe, I'd advise you to sit down. Who do you think you are? She hissed. The man whose company you tried to deceive, he replied evenly. Vanessa finally spoke, her voice trembling. Rachel, stop this, please. You're ruining our family. I met her eyes steady. I didn't ruin anything, Vanessa. You did every time you made a phone call, pretending to be me every time you told my clients I wasn't capable, every time you sabotaged something you couldn't control. She opened her mouth, but I pressed a button on the remote in my hand. Another file appeared on the screen. Email headers, timestamps, the Monroe Communications IP address. Here, I said calmly, is the digital trail connecting every anonymous complaint to your PR firm. Vanessa's face drained of blood. My mother sank back into her chair, trembling fingers gripping the tablecloth. You don't understand, she said, almost pleading now. I did it to protect you. You were chasing something too big. I didn't want you to get hurt. You didn't protect me, I said quietly. You buried me, and you called it love. A wave of murmurs swept through the audience. Someone whispered, protect her. She destroyed her own daughter's business. I let the silence linger, letting every eye in the room settle on the truth. For once, I didn't flinch under the weight of their stares. I met them head on. My mother once told me success is only respectable if it looks effortless, I said, my voice steady. But every woman in this room knows that's a lie. Success costs. It takes nights without sleep, hands that shake, hearts that break, and sometimes it takes standing against the people who taught you to kneel. The applause started slow, hesitant, then grew until the sound filled the hall. My mother sat frozen, Vanessa looking as if she might faint. When the lights brightened, Elliot stepped forward and addressed the guests. Ward Industries has reviewed the evidence. Effective immediately, we're reinstating our contract with Luna Events and terminating all public relations partnerships with Monroe Communications. Additionally, legal counsel will be reviewing the fraudulent activities presented tonight. He turned toward me, his tone softening. Miss Monroe, your integrity is why we chose you. Tonight only confirmed that we were right. The guests erupted again, a mix of applause and disbelief. I barely heard them. My pulse pounded in my ears. Mother stood slowly, her voice a thread. You'll regret this. I looked at her, exhaustion and clarity colliding in my chest. Maybe. But at least the regret will be mine. She stumbled toward the exit, Vanessa hurrying after her photographers, snapping like wolves. For the first time, they looked small. When the noise died down, Elliot approached me with a glass of water. You all right? I think so, I said, though my voice shook. It's strange, feels like exhaling after years of holding my breath. He smiled faintly. That's called freedom. Elizabeth appeared next, eyes shining. You did it. You actually did it. I just told the truth, I said. That's all it ever took. No, she said, squeezing my hand. It took courage. We stepped outside into the crisp night air. The vineyard glowed in the distance, its vines ghostly silver under the moonlight. For a long moment, none of us spoke. Behind us, reporters swarmed the club entrance. Inside, I could hear people already rewriting the story, praise for my bravery, condemnation for my mother's deceit. But none of it mattered now. Elliot joined me by the fountain, hands in his pockets. You realize this changes everything, he said. I know. Your company will be front-page news tomorrow. Not for the scandal, I said, a faint smile on my lips. For surviving it? He studied me for a long moment, then said quietly, You remind me of someone I used to be before I learned how ugly ambition could get. Then maybe tonight we both remembered what it's supposed to be." He nodded once, and in the reflection of the water, I saw something in his expression that wasn't just respect. It was recognition. Elizabeth came out, her phone buzzing nonstop. Ward's PR team just released a statement confirming everything. "The tide's turning. Let it," I said. "For once, I'm not the one hiding from the light." As we walked toward the parking lot, flashes from cameras followed us. I didn't hurry. I didn't duck my head. For the first time, being seen didn't feel dangerous, it felt right. At the end of the drive, Elliot paused. "What will you do now?" I looked out over the vineyards. The same place that had once smelled of humiliation now smelled of rain and possibility. "Rebuild," I said simply, "not out of spite, out of purpose." He smiled. "Then I hope you'll let us be part of that." "Maybe," I said. "After all, we've already survived a public scandal together." He laughed softly. "That we have." When his car pulled away, I stood there a long time watching the taillights disappear down the winding road. My reflection in the dark window of the club caught my eye no longer. The servant girl carrying trays, no longer the daughter begging for approval. Inside, I could still hear faint echoes of applause, but it wasn't for the show. It was for survival. As the last guests trickled out, Elizabeth joined me again, her heels clicking softly. "You know," she said, "I've never seen anyone burn a dynasty so elegantly." I laughed low and tired. It was overdue. She looked at me with quiet admiration. "So what happens to them now?" "They'll do what they've always done," I said. "Pretend. Spin the story. Try to stay relevant." "And you," I turned toward the moon, its light falling clean and silver across the courtyard. "I build something real. No lies, no ghosts, just work that lasts." The wind carried the faint scent of grapes and smoke, and I realized it wasn't bitterness, I felt it was release. For the first time in my life, I wasn't reacting to their world. I was creating mine. Somewhere behind me, someone called my name, a reporter maybe, or a guest, hoping for a quote, but I didn't turn back. I walked toward the car heels clicking against the cobblestones, the sound echoing steady, sure, and final. By the time I reached the gate, the night had gone utterly still. I paused, looked up at the stars, and whispered to no one but myself. This was the last dinner I'll ever serve for them. Then I got into the car and drove toward the city, toward the life waiting on the other side of everything they tried to take away. 2 days later, I sat in the Ward Industries boardroom again. But this time the silence felt different. Not tense, measured. Controlled. The table stretched before me, a polished river of mahogany, lined with people whose names carried weight in the world I'd just entered. On one side sat Elliot and his executive team. On the other, Margaret and Vanessa Monroe, flanked by their lawyers. Rain streaked the floor-to-ceiling windows behind them. The city looked washed clean, but inside the air was thick with consequence. Elliot adjusted his cufflinks, his voice calm. "This meeting is to review the allegations against Luna Events, the corresponding evidence, and the conduct of Monroe Communications." My mother's chin lifted. "I don't appreciate being put on trial." Elliot's tone didn't change. "This isn't a trial, Mrs. Monroe. It's an accountability review." He turned to me. "Miss Monroe, please begin." I rose slowly, palms steady against the folder before me. "Thank you." The presentation screen lit with my first slide timeline of interference, 2018 to present. I spoke clearly, each word deliberate. Over the past 5 years, Luna Events has experienced a series of disruptions, lost contracts, false complaints, data leaks. Until recently, these appeared random. But as our records show, every instance occurred within 72 hours of a Monroe family gathering. Vanessa shifted in her seat. Mother's lawyer began to scribble notes. I clicked to the next slide, graphs, emails, timestamps, IP addresses. These patterns aren't speculation. They're verified through forensic analysis. Every anonymous complaint, every false audit traces back to Monroe Communications' internal network. Vanessa's voice cracked. That's impossible, is it? I interrupted softly. Because the digital signatures match your personal work login. Her lips parted, but no sound came. I looked at my mother. You financed it through your charitable foundation. Money meant for scholarships paid for proxy servers used to fabricate corporate misconduct. Margaret exhaled slowly as if I were an unruly child. I told you, Rachel. You're too emotional. You've twisted everything into some kind of vendetta. Vendetta, I let the word hang in the air. A vendetta would have stayed private. This is about integrity, mine, and the company you tried to destroy. Elliot leaned forward slightly. Please proceed. I opened the second folder. Attached are Luna's verified financial statements, certified by 2 independent firms. 15 years of clean audits. No discrepancies, no violations. James handed copies down the table, his movements calm, precise. Every figure cross-checked, he said. Every transaction transparent. Elizabeth stepped beside me. We also gathered letters from every major client. They confirm consistent satisfaction and performance above industry standards. I clicked to the next slide, photographs, charity galas, presidential fundraisers, hospital benefits, each event stamped with the Luna logo. These aren't numbers, I said. They're proof of the life's work you dismissed as a hobby. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the projector. Mother folded her arms. You think humiliating us will make you respectable? No, I said. I think honesty will. Elliot cleared his throat, turning to his general counsel. The evidence regarding Monroe Communications, the attorney stood. Our independent investigation confirms direct interference with the Horizon contract and multiple previous attempts to obstruct Luna Events' operations. As such, Ward Industries will immediately terminate all agreements with Monroe Communications and file for damages related to defamation and corporate sabotage. The words hit like a gavel. Mother gripped the arm of her chair. You can't do that. Elliot's expression didn't waver. I already have. Vanessa turned on her. You said they'd never trace it back, Vanessa. Enough, Mother snapped, but her voice trembled. I gathered the folders, closing them gently. You taught me that image is everything, that control matters more than kindness. But control built on deceit always collapses. You just didn't expect it to happen in public. For a moment, I almost pitied her, the rigid posture, the defiant eyes that hid fear underneath. Almost. Elliot nodded toward me. Miss Monroe, before we conclude, I'd like to acknowledge that Luna Events has demonstrated remarkable integrity. The Horizon contract remains yours. Additionally, the board has voted to expand your partnership to all Ward properties worldwide. A murmur spread through the room. I felt my pulse catch. Worldwide, he smiled faintly. You've earned it. My throat tightened. For years, I'd dreamed of validation from the people who'd never give it. I hadn't realized until that moment that it didn't need to come from them. Mother stood abruptly. This is absurd. You're being manipulated by her. She's using you. Elliot rose too, his tone still composed. Mrs. Monroe, this meeting is over. My security team will escort you out. She froze, looking at him, then at me. For the first time, I saw confusion in her eyes, not anger. You'll regret this, Rachel, she whispered. Family is the only thing that lasts. I met her gaze. Then I guess we were never really family. She turned sharply and walked out, Vanessa, following a step behind, face pale, eyes downcast. When the door closed, the sound echoed like the final page of a book snapping shut. Elliot looked at me. Are you all right? I nodded, though. I wasn't sure what I felt. Relief, grief, something in between. I will be. The board members began filing out. James clapped me lightly on the shoulder. 15 years of doing things right, he said quietly. Today proved it mattered. Elizabeth smiled through tears. You did it, Rachel. You won. I sank into a chair, exhaling the breath I'd been holding since childhood. No, I said softly. I just stopped losing. Outside, the rain had faded to a mist. Through the window, I could see the city shimmering under the pale sun, every rooftop glistening clean. Elliot lingered. You know, most people would have settled for revenge. I used to think I would too, I said. But revenge fades. Integrity doesn't. He nodded slowly. You've earned more than a contract. You've earned a legacy. For the first time, I believed him. When I left the building, the air smelled like renewal, wet concrete, fresh rain, the kind of morning that promises you've survived the storm. I walked without umbrella, or hurry letting the drizzle touch my face. Somewhere deep inside, the years of being overlooked, dismissed and silenced fell away like dust. At a crosswalk, I paused and glanced at my reflection in the glass door of a cafe. The woman looking back wasn't the girl from Portland who served Christmas dinners or the sister holding trays at a wedding. She was something entirely new. Behind me, Elizabeth called out coffee. Before we head back, I smiled. Yeah. Let's celebrate something that actually matters. As we stepped inside, the bell above the door chimed softly. I inhaled the scent of roasted beans, warmth and peace. For the first time, I wasn't walking into someone else's world trying to prove I belonged. I was walking into my own. The new office smelled of fresh paint and lemon polish, the kind of clean that carried promise. Morning light poured through the glass walls, bouncing off the silver letters mounted at the entrance: Luna Events Integrity. Vision, Grace. I stood beneath them, coffee in hand, still half convinced I was dreaming. A year ago, those words existed only in my notebook, scrawled next to half-formed ideas. Now they gleamed 10 feet high, carved into the space I'd built from the rubble of everything I'd survived. Feels different, doesn't it? Elizabeth's voice came from behind me. She was smiling, her auburn hair swept neatly back, tablet tucked under her arm. It does, I said, running my fingers along the cool metal letters. Feels like the air itself has stopped holding its breath. James appeared from the corridor, sleeves rolled, carrying 2 folders. Financial reports, quarterly updates. 35% growth since January. Elizabeth grinned. I told you we'd break 30 before summer. 35, I repeated softly. After everything. I walked toward the window, overlooking downtown Seattle. The city glittered under a pale sky, the Space Needle in the distance like a sentinel. It struck me that this was the same skyline I'd stared at from my apartment window when everything was falling apart. Back then, I was fighting just to keep the lights on. Now Luna occupied an entire floor. Elizabeth gestured toward the conference room. Come on, CEO. Time to open your first leadership meeting in the new office. Inside, 30 employees, our team stood waiting. Designers, planners, logistics managers, people who'd believed in me even when headlines didn't. Their applause filled the room when I walked in, unexpected and overwhelming. I laughed, holding up my hands. Okay, save the clapping for after the next Horizon Gala. The laughter settled and I found my voice again. A year ago, we were in a borrowed workspace with half our vendors running scared. You stayed. You believed in what we could be, not just what we were accused of being. And today, we stand here stronger, cleaner, louder. We don't just plan events anymore. We define excellence. The room erupted again, and for a moment I had to look away before emotion cracked my voice. After the meeting, I lingered in the empty conference room, fingers tracing the smooth wood of the table. Elizabeth entered quietly. You realize, she said, you've become the kind of woman younger you would have idolized. God, I hope not, I said, laughing softly. Younger me thought approval was oxygen. She tilted her head. And now I breathe on my own. We watched the city for a long moment, a comfortable silence between us. Then Elizabeth reached into her bag and handed me a folder embossed with silver. What's this? The next step, she said. The Luna Foundation proposal. Inside were plans, budgets, and outreach models, everything we discussed late at night in those first weeks after the hearing. Funding programs for women entrepreneurs, mentorship initiatives, legal support for businesswomen facing family interference. Family interference, I repeated, smiling wryly. That's polite. It's honest, she said. We both know how many women need what you needed. I closed the folder and nodded. Let's do it. But not as charity as opportunity. Elizabeth's eyes softened. That's why it'll work. Later that afternoon, as the team dispersed for lunch, the elevator doors opened and Elliot Ward stepped out. He looked at home in this space, as if he'd been part of it all along. New office suits you, he said, glancing around. And you've already outgrown it. Don't jinx me, I said with a grin. He offered a small velvet box, a housewarming gift from Ward Industries. Inside was a silver pen engraved with 3 words, Luna, integrity, legacy. I turned it over in my hand. You really believe in the legacy part? He met my gaze. I've watched you turn survival into architecture. I'd say that qualifies. We stood by the window, the skyline reflected in the glass before us. You could have joined us, you know, he said. Chief Event Director, Global Operations. I wasn't joking. I know, I said quietly. But freedom built me. I can't sell it for comfort. He smiled. That's why I wanted you in the first place. Before he left, he paused at the door. The world's watching you now. Don't look away. I'm not afraid of the spotlight anymore, I said. It's warm here. That evening, Elizabeth and I stayed late, finalizing the foundation paperwork. The office emptied out, leaving the faint hum of computers and the soft glow of city lights. When the documents were signed, Elizabeth leaned back, stretching her arms. You realize this means we're officially insane, right? Running a global firm and a foundation, I smiled. Insanity built every good thing we have. She laughed, shaking her head. What are you naming the first program? The Horizon Initiative, I said after a beat. For every woman who's ever been told her sky has limits. Elizabeth reached for her glass of wine. To Horizons, then. To Horizons, I echoed, clinking mine against hers. We sat there a while longer, talking about everything and nothing, the women we'd already contacted, the letters pouring in from across the country. Stories of mothers, daughters, sisters who'd been undermined, dismissed, or silenced by people who claimed to love them. It struck me then how much of the pain I'd carried wasn't unique. It was inherited, shared by so many who'd never found their way out. And maybe that's why this mattered. Maybe revenge had only ever been the doorway to something greater. A week later, I got a call I didn't expect. Vanessa. Her voice was small, almost unfamiliar. Rachel, I know I'm the last person you want to hear from. You're right, I said. But I'm trying. I left Monroe Communications. I'm starting over. I wanted to say I'm sorry. The silence between us stretched long. Finally, I said, I'm not sure forgiveness fixes anything, but I hope you find what you couldn't when you were tearing me down. She sniffed quietly. Mother won't talk to anyone. She moved to Florida. It's not pretty. Maybe now she'll have to look at herself, I said softly. I just thank you, Vanessa whispered, for not destroying us when you could have. I didn't do it for you, I said. I did it for me. After the call, I sat by the window again, watching the sun slide behind the skyline. Below, traffic glittered like veins of light threading through the city. Elizabeth knocked lightly on my door. Everything okay? I nodded. It's strange. For the first time I feel light. Peace will do that, she said. 6 months later, we hosted the first Luna Foundation Gala at the Waldorf Hotel. The ballroom glowed with gold light, the air full of laughter and possibility. Women from across the country, entrepreneurs, artists, teachers, stood together trading stories and ideas. When it was my turn to speak, I stepped onto the stage, the same spot where I once stood, humiliated, the same kind of chandelier glittering overhead. Success requires talent, I said, my voice carrying through the hall, but peace requires boundaries. And every woman deserves both. Applause thundered, echoing through my chest. Down front, I saw Elizabeth smiling, James nodding proudly, and to my surprise, Elliot clapping, eyes shining with something that looked like pride. For a heartbeat, I thought about my mother, about the woman she'd been, and the one she couldn't become. Then I let her memory go, like air released from a held breath. After the event, as I walked off stage, Elizabeth handed me a champagne flute. To surviving, she said. I raised mine. No, I said softly. To living. We stood beneath the chandeliers while cameras flashed and laughter swirled the moment bright and infinite. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I'd climbed out of their world. I felt like I'd built my own. Snow fell over Manhattan like sifted sugar, blanketing the streets in quiet light. Through the tall windows of the Waldorf ballroom, the city looked almost gentle, as if the chaos below had agreed to pause for one night. Inside the room pulsed with warmth and music. Gold ribbons curled around champagne flutes. Laughter rang against crystal chandeliers. It was the one-year anniversary of the Luna Foundation. I stood near the stage, the hem of my silver dress, brushing the marble floor, watching the guests move like slow constellations. Elizabeth's voice floated through the microphone. Tonight we celebrate a year of impact. Over 200 women funded 50 new businesses, launched hundreds of lives changed. But none of this would exist without the woman who refused to let injustice silence her. The crowd began to applaud. I felt the familiar flush rise in my cheeks. Elizabeth gestured toward me. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Rachel Monroe. The applause swelled, rolling over me like a tide. I took the stage, the microphone cool beneath my fingers, the spotlights warm on my skin. For a moment, I stood in silence, just breathing, feeling the weight of everything that had led to this moment. A year ago, I began. I stood in a room like this one, but I was invisible. I poured wine, served food, smiled through humiliation. And when I finally spoke, my voice trembled so badly, I thought it would break. I paused, scanning the faces before me. But sometimes the moment you stop trembling is the moment you start living. Laughter rippled through the room, soft understanding. This foundation wasn't built from revenge, I continued. It was built from the ashes of it. Because payback ends, but purpose lasts. Every woman who walked through our doors carried her own story of dismissal, doubt, and survival. We didn't fix them. We simply handed them the light they already had inside. The applause rose again, full and real. When I stepped down from the stage, Elizabeth was waiting with a glass of champagne. You still make me cry, you know that occupational hazard, I said, smiling. James joined us holding 2 envelopes. Financial update quarterly report. The foundation's revenue is up 40%. We're expanding to Denver next month. I raised my glass. To Denver and to the impossible. To the impossible, Elizabeth echoed. We clinked glasses, the sound sharp and bright. Around us, the gala buzzed with conversation. I spotted several of our scholarship recipients, young women in elegant gowns, laughing alive. They weren't the polished perfection my mother used to worship. They were something better, real. At the far end of the ballroom, I saw Elliot Ward. He was speaking with a small group of investors, his tuxedo sharp, his expression calm. When he noticed me watching, he excused himself and crossed the room. You've outdone yourself, he said. So have you, I replied. I heard Ward Industries launched a joint program with Luna to fund female-led startups. He nodded. Partnership felt like the natural next step. You've proven that ethics and success don't have to be enemies. That's what happens when you stop asking for permission, I said softly. He smiled. Do you ever think about what would have happened if we hadn't met that night at your sister's wedding? I laughed quietly. I think about it every day. Funny how disaster can open the right door. He raised his glass. To spilled wine and second chances. I touched my glass to his. To both. As the evening wore on, I slipped out onto the balcony for air. Snow dusted the city below, and traffic lights glowed red and green reflections, dancing off wet pavement. The hum of music and conversation faded behind the glass doors. For the first time that night, I was alone with the quiet. My phone buzzed softly. A single message from an unknown number. I saw your speech. You were magnificent. No name, but I knew who it was. My mother had always loved elegant phrases. I stared at the screen for a moment before typing back, thank you. I hope you're well. 3 dots blinked. Then her reply came, I'm learning to be. I hope you can forgive me someday. I set the phone down on the railing, exhaling into the cold. Forgiveness wasn't a door I could force open, but maybe someday it would unlock on its own. Behind me, the balcony doors opened. Elizabeth stepped out, her shawl draped over her shoulders. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," I said, "just thinking about how far we've come." She joined me at the railing. "You know, when we first started Luna, I thought we were just building a company. I didn't realize we were building a mirror. A mirror for women to finally see what they look like when they stop apologizing." I smiled at that. That's poetic. Truth usually is. The band inside started playing a slow, familiar tune, Sinatra's "Fly Me to the Moon." Elliot appeared at the doorway holding out his hand. "Dance break," he called. Elizabeth grinned and gave me a gentle nudge. "Go on, boss." I joined him under the soft glow of the balcony lights. The music floated through the open doors, blending with the snow. For a moment we said nothing. The world outside blurred the city, shimmering beneath us like a living thing. Elliot's hand was warm against mine. "You know," he said quietly, "most people spend their whole lives trying to prove they belong in rooms like these. You built the room instead." I met his eyes, and then opened the doors. He smiled. "Exactly." We danced until the last notes faded, until laughter spilled back onto the balcony and the city's hum returned. When he released my hand, the world felt lighter, somehow anchored yet endless. By midnight, the gala wound down. Guests filtered out with hugs and promises, the kind that would actually be kept. Elizabeth was coordinating final details with the staff when I walked back into the ballroom one last time. The chandeliers shimmered softly over empty tables, and the faint scent of roses lingered in the air. I walked to the center of the floor where a year ago I'd stood humiliated, invisible. Now the silence felt sacred. I closed my eyes and whispered to the space we did it. No applause followed. No flashbulbs or headlines. Just peace, the quiet kind that hums in your bones when you finally stop running. Later, as I rode home through the sleeping city, snowflakes brushed the car window like sparks of memory. I thought of the girl I used to be, the one who stayed late at family dinners waiting for a thank you that never came. I hoped she could see this, could feel that we'd made it to the other side. When I reached my apartment, I left my gown draped over a chair, kicked off my heels, and stood barefoot at the window overlooking the skyline. The lights below glittered like a promise. I picked up the silver pen Elliot had given me months ago and opened a blank page in my journal. December 23rd. 1 year since everything changed. I used to think power came from control. It doesn't. It comes from letting go of what you can't fix and building what you can. They called me emotional, stubborn, difficult. Maybe I am. But emotion built my empire, stubbornness kept it alive, and difficulty made it worth it. I closed the journal and smiled. Outside, church bells rang softly through the night. Another Christmas was coming. Another year, another chapter. But this time there was no kitchen, no tray, no humiliation. Just the woman I'd become, watching her city shine. I lifted my glass toward the window, whispering to the snow, to the skyline, to every woman still standing in the shadows of someone else's story. "Step into your own light," I said. "It's brighter than you think." And as the bells faded and the city glowed below, I finally felt it, the full weight of freedom, not as a triumph or revenge, but as peace. If you've listened this far, tell me, what would you have done in my place? Would you have forgiven them or burned the bridge completely? Either way, I'd love to hear your story. Because maybe, like me, you've learned that sometimes the sweetest revenge is simply becoming the woman they said you could never be. So don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, because somewhere out there another story of resilience is waiting to be told. And I'll be right here, ready to tell it.